Hello, my name is Tucker Johnson, and I am your host today as we experience NIMSY Live, where we talk about the latest and greatest in translation, localization, internationalization, culturalization, and all that fun stuff global companies need to delight their international customers, or at least to not piss them off too much. On this program, we invite guests who like to have fun and have some value to add for our audience of globalization professionals. I'm always eager to provide a platform to those with a good story or a good data set. So let us know if there are any topics you'd like covered or guests we should reach out to for future episodes. If you haven't already done so, now is your time to subscribe to NIMSY Insights on your platform of choice. We are coming to you live today on X, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Of course, most folks join us over on LinkedIn in the live event. If that's you, then make sure that you are leaving your questions and comments in the comment section during the live stream and talking to each other, networking during the event. And we can bring those up on screen somehow. We will bring your comments up on screen during the stream and address those as they come up. Before we get into today's topic, I wanted to give a quick shout out to Multilingual Magazine, because today's conversation is following up on an article from Multilingual Magazine where we interviewed Loy Searle, our guest today, and it's called The Art of Improvement. It's on page 43 of the magazine. So if you're following along in the June issue, the one with the sun on the cover, you can follow along over on page 43, and we're going to be diving deeper into the things that were discussed there today. And speaking of Multilingual Magazine, there's a number of different ways that you can connect with Multilingual Magazine. The first, of course, is the magazine itself. We all know and love that one. But also over at multilingual.com, many folks don't know this, we have daily industry news that is being published. It's available for everybody, subscriber or not. Daily industry news available at multilingual.com. There's also a podcast, so which I love, especially for accessibility reasons. If you're not big on reading the news every day, you can go check out Localization Today, which is a podcast you can subscribe to on your platform of choice. Here we have Apple Podcast version right here, and you can just listen to an audio version of the daily news. If that's too much for you, we also have a week in review available on our YouTube channel over at Multilingual Media, and I highly recommend you go check that out. And I just wanted to give you guys a quick taste of this, because this is a new thing that Multilingual Magazine is doing. So I'll show you what that's all about here.
It's news in the language services industry. I'm your host, Eddie Arrieta. Let's dive right in. Respawn Crisis Translation, a language justice collective of 2,500 translators and interpreters, is closing the gap for asylum seekers lacking basic translation and interpretation access within the U.S. asylum system. Read this story at teamvogue.com. Also, some people who worked on translating Baldur's Gate 3 into Brazilian Portuguese for several years ended up missing from the game's credits. Larian eventually added the names of the translators previously uncredited by localization firm Altacron. Go to GameWorldServer.com for more information. And this week, the Justice Department released an updated department-wide language access plan to help ensure that all individuals, regardless of language use, have access to and are able to fully participate in the department's programs, activities, and services. Read all about it at justice.gov. Finally, project leaders at the MIT Language Acquisition Lab said their research could shed new light on the nature of language learning. Funds from the Levitan Prize have made it possible for the lab to collect initial data for a multi-study endeavor over a few years. The project could now be developed into a major grant proposal. You can read this story at news.mit.edu. Catch up on that and press releases from Bilingual Global, Phrase, and Translated by visiting multilingual.com, where you will also find our latest issue in its digital version. This has been a week in review. Remember to leave your comments and questions below and subscribe to our channels for more language industry updates. Until next time, goodbye.
Thank you, Eddie. So that's just a quick taste for you of what's available over at on Multilingual's YouTube channel, which is just a great resource that many people didn't know about. So I wanted to make you aware of that. But without further ado, let's jump into today's topic. Our conversation today is going to span a broad spectrum as we are speaking with a very experienced industry veteran who has a lot to say on a lot of topics. This conversation is following the recent published interview with her. As I mentioned, that's in the June issue on page 42. We're going to explore the intricate workings of the language services value chain. And for those of you who've never wondered about the subtleties that go into ensuring high quality translations, we're delving deep into the nuance and practice of quality. But it's not just about the art, it's also about the business. We're going to be discussing the nitty gritty of budgets, funding, and the challenges of managing procurement in this industry. Lastly, choosing the right partners is crucial, so we're going to touch upon vendor selection, how to manage internal stakeholders effectively, and of course, we'll round off our conversation by discussing the joys and rewards that come from dedicating oneself to this awesome industry. We're in for a treat today because I am joined by Loy Searle. Loy knows a thing or two about driving efficiency in localization work, and no wonder. She's honed her professional philosophy over 2 decades of experience working with major business players and experience with all sides of the market. She's charted a career learning at companies like JD Edwards, Intuit, Google, Deluxe Entertainment Services, and more. I once heard her describe herself as a localization fixer who loves taking on new challenges and solving problems. And she is, I would say, uniquely positioned to understand the professional process from beginning to end. Loy, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us
Oh,
today.
thanks, Tucker. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, did I leave anything out from that introduction?
No, I think it might be somebody else you're talking about, but
Yeah,
thanks.
yeah, I know, right? That's when I hear people introduce me, I think the same thing. I'm like, wow, I sound really good on paper.
Who is that?
Good
Who
thing they
is
haven't met
that?
me yet. Well, thank you for your contribution to the recent article of Multilingual. No, not so recent anymore. It was back in June, but I really enjoyed reading a little bit more about your perspectives and your experience. And of course, you and I have known each other for a while, so but haven't gotten a chance to chat with you. So this gives us a great opportunity to catch up here, and hopefully for our listeners to learn something from you.
Hope so.
Um, I wanted just to, as usual, when I'm interviewing someone from a recent issue of Multilingual, I've pulled up some quotes here, and so let me just bring up some stuff on screen here from your article and page 42 if you're following along at home, guys. But let's jump right into it. You mentioned in your interview, you said the supplier side teaches flexibility, responsiveness, customer engagement, and heroics. I love that. I'm from the supplier side myself. It's a service industry, which means you get what you get and just do your best to deliver what is expected. It's rare on the service side to impact an incoming process. Possible, but rare. So that's speaking about the working on the vendor side, essentially, which you
Hmm.
have experience doing. You were at Deluxe for a number of years. But you also have a lot of experience on the client side, working with Intuit, Google, now Workday. And you say on the client side, the same skills are fundamentally required because most of us are services partners within our own organizations. That said, on the client side, the expectation is that we all work to improve upstream processes. We are also in the business of learning, automating, and refining our processes and usually can expect a degree of predictability. Process improvement is always preferred over heroics. That said, sometimes heroics are still required. And so much good little tidbits in here. But I love having these conversations with folks that have that experience both on the vendor and the client side because I think there's a lot of misconceptions out there, both from people that have spent their entire career on the vendor side, as well as people that have spent their entire career on the buyer side. My first question to you would be is how difficult is that to change from the vendor side to the client side or vice versa? Or, and you kind of touched upon it here, but are those skills all transferable? Because I think there's this perception I've seen, I've held before, let's just be honest, that, in order to get a client side job, you need to have past client side experience and vice versa. What's your takeaway on that?
So I do think that we make within our industry more of a barrier for folks to move from the services side to the client side. Like I've certainly seen that. I think that a lot of it is similar, and like the services nature of it does not go away.
Hmm.
Whether you are client side or whether you are supplier side, we are still a service profession. We still have stakeholders that we have to make happy, and we can't always control when they're sending us what, and the timelines that we have and all of that. So, I mean, my hit is the biggest difference, if you look across the two areas, would be there's an expectation. There's a deep expectation on the client side that you build the plumbing, you build the processes, you build an approach that will allow you to scale, to grow, to continue to do the work predictably, even when it shows up at the last minute. But that also means that you get to go upstream and talk to stakeholders and try to help them make their processes better as they work with you. Usually you don't get to do that the first time they send a train wreck your way. Usually that comes after the first
Yeah,
train
yeah,
wreck.
yeah. They got to learn. Yeah, they've got to be
Usually
motivated
it's
to improve,
Yeah,
right?
usually it's like, hey, we need this now. And then you get through that and you go, okay, let's not do that again, that same way ever, ever, ever again.
Yep.
And then you go back and try to work through the processes and make it better. And that's pretty typical, I would say, on the client side. On the supplier side, it's so much harder to get a customer to change how they're doing,
Oh, sure.
especially when they're in the middle of their own process themselves. So I've also, on the supplier side, you don't always have the authority in the room, you
Right.
know? So
Or
I
the
think
authority of the
those,
room or the credibility too.
Mhm.
I think there's also kind of this prejudice that exists where I've seen clients react this way. It's like, oh, you're the vendor, right? Like,
Mhm.
know your place. Like, I'm the client, therefore I
Mhm.
know more than you.
Yeah.
And just saying, like, I'm biased because I'm a vendor side guy, right? So I'll just put that out there right now. I'm totally biased, but in my experience, the vendor often knows. I wouldn't say they know more. They don't have the depth of knowledge because they don't know the specific internal things that each client is dealing with, that are specific to that organization. But they have a breadth of knowledge and
Mhm.
experience because, yeah, they're working on your program, but they're also working on 10, 15, 20 other programs. And they can
Exactly.
know, like, oh, this works really well for this other client. Maybe we can implement something over there.
Yeah. They'll have best practices the client side may not have.
Uh huh.
They also know how it works within their process.
Yep.
And a lot of times client side doesn't dig deep enough to know how that process works. So they, may have magical thinking about how things get done. So yeah, I think that the other piece I would add to that is we don't accomplish anything on our own on the client side. Like, what can we deliver?
Preach it, sister. Yeah, no.
What
Well,
can we deliver on our own? Nothing.
and that can be said going down.
Yeah.
To be fair, that can be said about the vendor side too, because
It's
LSPs are hiring. They have their own supply chains, right?
Yeah, this is true.
So,
This is true.
and I say this all
Yeah.
the time: the value that LSPs bring to the table are project management, vendor management, but
Mhm.
very rarely do you see an LSP these days with actual in-house translators.
Yeah. Not
So
as often.
the value chain
We're
goes deep.
yeah, we're profoundly codependent by design as an industry.
Codependent by design, yes, and it's a fascinating industry. I'm not going to say it's unique because I don't know what other industries are out there, but it's an industry that's really dependent upon the supply chain. This whole
Mhm.
ecosystem in this industry that's been built up from the client side to these large LSPs that contract smaller LSPs that contract
Yep.
the translators, and it works. And every once in a while, I'll see, and because we work with a lot of different clients here at MZ, and every once in a while, a client will have a bright idea to cut out the middleman, right? And usually,
Mhm.
this is someone like a VP or a director level person gets shifted from another department into
Mhm.
localization. They don't understand the value why
Mhm.
that supply chain exists, and they're like, "Oh, I have this great idea that no one has ever had before, and I'm gonna cut out the middleman and work directly with freelancers." And you know, have you had experience with that? How's that work
I
out?
have totally been part of that experiment in my
Yeah.
past.
Most of us have.
The only thing good I can say about that kind of an experiment, because I think there is something good to say about it. I think what most people who make that decision don't realize is how many PMs they're going to have to hire. Like really what the burden is.
Right. What are the internal costs going to change
Yeah,
to?
what are the internal costs that you have no idea what they are, trying to figure out who's on vacation in which country at which time, doing what thing, and what other stuff are they working on? Like that's just, it becomes pretty tough pretty fast. But there is one thing that can come out of that I have seen that can be goodness, especially for companies that don't understand how the process works at the vendor side at all. They don't have any visibility to it.
Mhm.
Is you can get a much tighter awareness about how to make a better experience for the translators themselves,
Oh,
So I do think it's possible for that learning to come in that process, but that's about it, right?
well, and that's
Because
exactly what I
otherwise
was.
you have to manage a lot.
Yeah, and I was thinking that too when you earlier in the conversation you used the words magical thinking.
Yeah.
And I resisted the urge to go down that, but now I'm going to go down that way. I think sometimes on the client side, folks, so if I spend 10 years you worked at Google. If I spend 10 years working at Google, I know really well how localization is done at Google. I don't necessarily know how localization is done at other places, but I know really well. And I'm going to conferences and I'm participating in industry events and I'm listening to awesome podcasts online. And I'm hearing these other people from, let's say, Facebook or Amazon or Microsoft, my competitors, so to speak, my colleagues, my peers. And they're saying, oh, we have this new system that does X, Y, and Z. And they're out there bragging about all of this cool stuff. And I start thinking, oh, I want some of that cool stuff. Right. And I think they can sometimes get this misperception of like what's real and what's marketing and bragging to
Yeah.
call it what it is. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, I've read RFPs before, helping clients respond to RFPs, where it's like literally the depth of it is we want you to propose how we want to include AI in our workflow. So how are we going to use AI? And this is like 5 years ago. This isn't today, right? And it's like, okay, someone went to a conference where they talked about AI,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm. And that better show up for procurement to pick up, this particular plan, like that's required now in all of the procurement cases,
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and you talk about procurement a little bit in your article, managing procurement. So going to the client side of the equation, you said, well, first of all, my first question is you mentioned a lot of your job is working upstream and working with your internal stakeholders who are essentially your clients,
Yeah.
for all intents and purposes.
Yeah.
And thank you for not using the term educating because I hate that term. I think it's kind of pretentious. People don't like to be educated, but they do want folks that are interested in helping them solve their problem. So my first question is, if I'm on the client side, as you are currently, how much of my time is spent upstream managing internal stakeholders or working with internal stakeholders, and how much of is it spent looking down, so to speak, at the supply chain?
You know what? I would say what I wish and what I always do are not always the same thing. So
Perfect.
there's that.
Everyone's a
The
hypocrite.
best advice
So,
versus like what you get it hooked into. Um, I try to always have on my calendar strategic stakeholder outreach and be presenting and be sharing and be engaging either with new stakeholders or with existing stakeholders to keep them informed of how we're doing at kind of a high level.
mhm.
Like my job is to hit a certain level across the organization. The managers under me have a job to hit the next level,
Yep.
and all the way down the organization, there's a responsibility to engage with our stakeholders. So I think it's funny to think about it, but I actually think in some weird way we're in sales. You know,
Yep. I say that all the
our
time.
our
Yep.
job is to go out and talk to all the teams that aren't working with us to get them to work with us. Our job is to find the people that are working with somebody else on the sly and it didn't even show up and procurement didn't know it and
slided
nobody
through the
knew it,
procurement process
and
under the
pull
radar.
those
Yeah.
into the fold.
Yeah.
And sometimes it can take a long time to find all those little things, especially in the international field where there may be something hidden under admin that you don't even know exists. But I do think that, hurting stakeholders and hurting everyone so that they are working with your business is really important. And aligning at a high level with stakeholders so that we don't create extra friction below in the process in working with those stakeholders. So that's like kind of my job, is open the door and make certain that we have high level expectations, and then we begin working with them. And then usually most of the time things go pretty smoothly. It may look rugged and rough inside our organization, but generally the stakeholders don't have that same experience.
Well, and if you're providing a good service, because here's the crucial component, because I couldn't just tell client side folks to go out there and engage your stakeholders and get them to work with you. Like, first you got to make sure your own house is in order. They've got to have a reason to work with you, because if they're like working with their own translation vendor, for example, and the process is going swimmingly, but the localization department is a hot mess, why would they come work with you?
Exactly. Yeah.
Right?
I mean, in general, I look at what we do as in support of the company strategy that we're part of.
Mm-hmm.
So where possible, try to build in and hook to that company strategy so that we are solving the problem the company's solving and not something different, right? So that helps, because everyone should be aligned on the company strategy. So that's a good place to meet stakeholders, is in that strategy space, if you can find an alignment place. I think the other thing is sometimes it takes time. Sometimes it can take a long time to get a team that might be used to working with another vendor to finally want to work with you as a team. And one approach I've used that has worked pretty well over the years is to take that vendor on. So basically, okay, fine, that's your vendor.
Yeah.
Then one of our vendors will make it work. And then the team works
with TMs and glossaries and best practices.
We'll work with that vendor and get them at least better attuned within our process. And we may not want 20 of them. And I've seen a stupid number of vendors to have at different points in time. You work with them, and sometimes that works out great. Sometimes they're a really good adjunct to your vendor channel. Sometimes it's more of a get them into our channel and get that new stakeholder comfortable working with our team as the face, as the front, as the process owner.
Trust building.
And what often happens, I think, is over time, because they get used to working with our team and recognize, wow, there's somebody who cares about my stuff. There's somebody who will make certain my files aren't going to be bad, and the process is going to work, and they're following up with a vendor. When they get used to that and they get comfortable with that, a lot of times they don't really care who the vendor is underneath. And then the right decisions can be made about which vendor for which work. So I think the most important thing is get them in your family first.
Yeah.
You can, and
then
went to my vendors and said, go use these guys. We like them. They just can't do it all. They're one of our family. But
so wait until you fire their favorite vendor and replace them with your own.
Don't do it immediately. Good luck working with them, because everything you do they'll be keeping score.
Exactly.
It's much easier to bring their vendors into your family. And if they're a good vendor, then if possible, they may make sense under one of your other vendors. And that might be a relationship to say, hey, we'd like you guys to work with them. We don't want to send projects to 5 vendors. We'd like to send it to one, but this is one of the vendors we think you should work with. And I've done that a lot with language specific vendors, because you end up, small, you start out small, you get a lot of language specific vendors, but it's not practical to send projects to 6 vendors.
Yeah, I'm working on this process audit right now for a client of ours, where we're taking a look at their program. And so I'm interviewing all of their vendors, and they've got like 5 or 6, not an egregious number. And, my standard out of the box advice is like, try to consolidate, maybe not down to 1. Single sourcing comes with its own issues, but 2 or 3. right? But I'm looking at like this specific case, and I'm just like, yeah, 5 or 6 works for you, because they've got a separate vendor for China, because China is a priority market, and the local office really likes this vendor, right? They've got a separate vendor for Japan, because I mean, do I need to even elaborate? Right. So, and French Canadian, they've got their own vendor because that's a regulated market, and so it's like there can be really good reasons for that. Every program's unique.
Yeah. I've definitely worked in circumstances where the nature of the work that was flowing through, it wasn't a problem to
Yep.
send to different language vendors as an approach. It was practical for that kind of work.
Yeah.
Where I think it gets tricky is when you're sending lots of things across lots of different markets, and it's pretty much all this big stack of stuff going all around the world.
Yeah.
That's where the monolingual or single country and language vendors gets harder to manage.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And you talk in your article. Let me just pull it up here since we're on the topic of vendor selection. You say, let's talk about this, like how to pick vendors. You mentioned if your practice and language deliverables are small or just getting started, don't go with a big vendor. They will ignore you. Ooh,
Yes.
some controversy there. Find a vendor who matches your size and market expectations and work with them to mutually grow. If you are huge, don't go with the little guys. They'll struggle to scale, and it's not fair to beat them up when they don't have capital or systems to flex at scale. The more vendors you include, the more work for you and your procurement team, and it's not appropriate to put lots of vendors through this time intensive, costly process. So many good points in here. And where I see this happen a lot, or frequently, is when a localization director changes companies and goes from, let's say, Google. No, I'm not even going to use names, but goes from a company where they're managing a localization program and they've got 15, 20 internal loc PMs, and they've got a $20 million budget to spend on their supply chain. And then they get a good job working for a startup with $1 million, if that, of budget to spend on. And they think, oh,
Exactly.
I really liked working with We Localize, Lionbridge, RW, whoever it may be, right? I really liked working with Lionbridge at my past job, so I'm going to bring them on board for my new job. And they are just disappointed, because they're not going to get the same level of service from Lionbridge for $1 million as they did for $20 million.
Yeah. It's absolutely the truth. And I actually think this is one of those things you learn through this. A lot of people learn this through the School of Hard Knocks. I learned it early through the School of Hard Knocks myself.
It's the only way to learn.
Yeah. And what I learned in that process was my great big vendor from the past was exactly that. If you have 20 million to spend and then you have 2 million, you are no longer that interesting to them. Unless they can see your 2 million growing and they can see a pathway towards that, there is a good chance you need to swim in a different pond that fits your, the scale of your work and where your maturity is at the time. So yeah, I think it happens a lot, especially in our industry where people start in a big shop and then they end up at a startup.
Yeah, and to be clear, I don't want to like throw the Lion Bridges and We Localizes of the world under the bus. They say like, because it's easy to think like, oh, well, they're just in it for the money. They don't care about us. And it's like, no, because I come from the vendor side. It's like, they do care about you, but the way that they are structured, they are optimized to be able to make a margin working on $10 million projects. Yeah. And because I've had this before, I worked at a big guy. And if you give me a client that's sending me $100,000 a year, which a lot of smaller LSPs would be thrilled with that client. But if you give me that, as the program manager for that client, there was literally no way for me to be able to make a margin just because of the way our structures were set up. So it's not that I didn't want to give good service to the client. It was just really hard because of the way that we were set up.
Exactly. I actually even had the experience many years ago, many years ago, where I went to one of those big vendors before I learned the School of Hard Knocks, and they said, "You're too small for us. We won't work with you." And bless them for that.
Respect, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Bless them for that, because that's actually much better than saying, yeah, sure, come on board, when we will ignore you as best we can.
Agree. No, I have a lot of respect for that, and then
Yeah.
and hopefully, because I've done that before, working at a big
Yeah.
vendor, and then hopefully they would say, "Oh, by the way, here are some other vendors
Exactly.
that we
In
would
your
recommend."
range, in your specialization, you might try there instead. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think some.
It's something I encounter almost every year at industry events, is meeting somebody new who's coming in, and they'll always ask, what vendor should I go hire? And it's like, how big are you, and what are you doing, and what space are
Right.
you
And
in,
then let's talk
and
about which
where are you
TMS
in
is
your
the
maturity
best.
model?
And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So on vendor, sorry, I was checking these different slides here. Where do I want to go from here? I kind of want to go into quality, because
Okay.
we got a lot of topics here, and that's how you and I first met, working on a quality program, I think. But the quality encapsulates a lot, right, in what you're doing. And referencing back to our beginning conversation about aligning with company stakeholders, and like
Hmm.
what's important to the company should be important to the localization program. Like, one thing I say over and over again is nobody cares about your LQA scores besides you.
No,
They just
it's
don't.
true. It's
And
our underwear. It's very important underwear to us.
yeah, it is.
We need
It's
it.
not that it's
It's
not
really
important.
important to us. But
Yes.
although I would argue with that in
Okay.
one way,
Okay.
I will argue with that in one way. I had the experience in the past of having a super senior leader who spoke a certain language, who had an impression of our team's quality that was 5, 6 years old.
Okay.
So, a 6 year out of date impression of how good of a job we did in that language that she was a native speaker of.
Okay.
And there would really be no way that I could ever convince, like, she's busy. She's not spending her time looking at our quality, right?
Right.
So there would be no way that I would really change her mind about the past. But what I was able to do with data
I was
over
gonna say you need data, right?
about a year. It took about a year. Every time I met with her, I would show her the data on how we had improved and what our stakeholders thought, what our stakeholders said, our internal scores, our stakeholders' feedback. I would share this information, and within a year, she was like, and we've really improved the quality. So sometimes it takes, sometimes the LQA score can be useful in tandem with what your customers think
Right.
for your stakeholders,
That's fair.
especially when they hear anecdotal noise here and there.
Well, what I've found is LQA scores are important, but they're becoming not enough. So they're important,
Mhm.
but not sufficient, I would say. And for LQA scores, like, what I would say about LQA scores is they're a great place to start a conversation, because if there's no data, there's nothing to talk about.
Exactly.
Quality becomes, hey, I heard from my cousin that there was some bad stuff on the website. Like,
Hmm.
okay,
Yeah.
where do you take that
ab-
conversation? Right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think the reason you measure quality is so you can work with your vendors and you
Yes.
can work with the linguists to improve, and you have a conversation point on why this is a stylistic error, why this is, a terminology mistake, or why,
Yep. Yep.
something that was right for the type of a deliverable that was being done. So it helps. I think it's very difficult to have a conversation with someone about the quality of their work. We ask our people to do this all the time.
Yep.
And what LQA scores help us do is have that slightly uncomfortable conversation
Hmm.
about the work in a more objective manner
Yep.
that is easier to do.
Hmm.
Because if you don't talk about the work, it will not change.
Yes.
So if you don't talk about it, if you don't go through it, you can expect it again and again. So
Yep.
silence will produce the same results. And I think a lot of times what's interesting in our space is that we may have 20 awesome linguists working on a language in support of that language, and they're all great. But if they're not cooking the same meal, it's going to be a messed up kitchen.
Yeah.
So the LQA scores matter for building that alignment, building that consistency across a language deliverable, so you can come out with a deliverable that looks like One Voice, that looks like the same company, and not,
Some
everybody was
consistency.
great but different, right?
Yeah. A lot of quality is just about consistency, right?
Mhm.
And well,
Yeah.
and we can have that conversation next. Is like, how do you define quality? But from the interview from Multilingual, you said without standards, quality is impossible. Without customer ownership and engagement, vendors won't improve. Goals and KPIs are super useful, but won't work without support. Lastly, when a vendor suggests an improvement, if possible, act on it. The vendor-client relationship is a partnership. At the source of this relationship are translations and reviewers who are learning every day what is expected. So quality takes time, focus, data, and continuity.
Yeah.
And
It's not instant. It's not instant.
no,
It takes time.
yeah. And I hear this, I was just talking to a client the other day where they're looking, they're not happy with their quality of some priority languages. And they're working with a well-known LSP. This isn't some rinky-dink operation. And they're considering going to RFP. They're considering replacing them. They're considering bringing someone else on. By the way, this is a single sourced. This is why I'm not into like this. Don't put all of your localization eggs in one basket. But they're looking into hiring another LSP. And my first question in such scenarios, and it's a common scenario, is, well, what have you done with your current vendor to work with them to bring that back up, right? Because that's not only business is business. You don't owe them anything, but some would say you do. But I wouldn't say that like you owe it to them to give them the chance to improve. But I would make the argument that, hey, look, bringing on a new vendor is going to be a big pain in the butt. You owe
Really
it to
hard.
yourself, because take the
Yes.
easy path, take the wide road of working with your current vendor. And also, if you haven't done the work and investigated and like audited your own processes, maybe you're the problem.
Yeah. I really, really agree with you. I think that the effort to swap out a new vendor is huge.
Yep.
And
The result's not guaranteed.
And if you haven't figured out how to get quality with your current vendor, you definitely won't figure it out with the next, because it isn't the vendor usually.
Right.
There might be sub-vendor issues underneath and things like that. But by and large, the quality processes, we have to be part of that on the client side. If we are not part of that and do not own our piece of that in helping them be successful, they will not be successful.
Right.
It's also hard to onboard new vendors. So whenever you get a new one, it's not the vendor that anybody ever wants to work with.
No.
It's an investment that takes years to get there, and everyone will do their darndest within the team to go any place else rather than to that new vendor.
Yep.
And so that's hard. It takes time to make the relationship work, and to start over is to just rinse and repeat and do it all over again. So
Yep.
the only time I would say that I might disagree with that is if the vendor support model is so wildly different that it does not support the way that the business works. So like if your workflow processes and the way that you work and the way the vendor is set up does not support that happening without a tremendous amount of friction.
Yeah, like if
that's
you're
a wrong vendor fit.
Yeah, so like if you're using SmartLink and the vendor refuses to work in SmartLink, get rid of them, right? Like
I mean, there are things like that can be problematic, or if you have it is about matching your processes to also the right kind of vendor. Like if you are super technical with lots of plugins and lots of APIs and lots of automation that you're regularly introducing that came with about 10 minutes notice, you want a technical vendor that can at least partner with you in pain to try to solve around that, right? A non-technical partner would just throw bodies at it and you'll never be profitable for them. And so it'll be challenging in a different way.
But
so
I think like the way this conversation has gone has like this exception that we're saying, don't just jump to replace a vendor except blah, blah, blah. I think it's kind of proven our original point, because our original point was don't immediately replace a vendor just based upon quality. right? And now we're not talking about quality. We're talking about the services. We're talking about the
And
cultural
process.
fit, the
Yeah.
process,
Yeah.
right? So I think
Yeah.
those are much better reasons to look into
Yeah.
replacing a vendor.
And odds are good where if there's a quality issue, especially like you'll see it with specific markets, like Canadian French, just a hard market.
It's
Every
hard.
place I've ever worked in my entire life, it has never been an easy market.
It's hard.
And so like when Canadian French matters to your company, you're always kind of like, oh my God, couldn't we care more about just France? So, I mean, it's a hard market to get the good resourcing in because we're competing with the government, we're competing with everyone else. And it's always hard. And it's hard
Well,
pretty much across all the vendors.
yeah, well, because all of the
And
really
swapping a
qualified
vendor is
translators are
gonna
working for the
make it
government,
hard.
making good
Yeah.
government money with nice, secure jobs. They don't want to be freelancers working for your OSP.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
it's been set up to be a really, really hard market.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I wouldn't
And the cost of failure is high too,
Yeah.
because it's regulated. So if you mess up
Yeah.
your localization, you could be literally facing fines.
It's all of those things. So yeah, I think that's one of those where you just have to work over time to get the relationships with vendors and sub vendors, like that whole little family of vendors to support the work takes time to build, and it takes trust to build, and it's not overnight, and it can be pretty rough while it's being built.
And keeping on the topic of quality, there's another quote that I pulled here. So we talked kind of about the implications or the practicality of quality, but what is quality, right? The nuance of quality, exactly. So you mentioned quality is similarly nuanced. First step is always determining what level of quality is appropriate and what the customer needs and expects. There is a spectrum from raw MT being okay to trans creation. And I could take that even one step further and go to in-market copy creation. Right?
Yeah, you create your own thing,
Exactly.
or just creation, you know.
Or just creation.
Hey,
Yeah.
we're just going to do that video in that market. We're not going to translate anything. You know?
Exactly, which is getting more feasible with large language models these days. But that's a whole, I don't want to get into that.
A whole nother can of worms.
Yeah, exactly. You say, I believe the one thing that impacts quality the most is assuming ownership to support the vendors to continuously improve. So,
Yeah.
I mean, this question is, I ask this all the time, what is quality? And it's not because I don't have an answer. It's because when I'm having a conversation with Loy about quality, in order to have a meaningful conversation, I first need to know what your definition is.
Exactly. And I think actually, when you look at this question, the hardest thing about this question is there is very often a quality expectation on the customer or on the stakeholder side that may not even be in alignment with our own internal practices and processes, because we like to do the very best work we can do. It's really hard to do the second best work that we can do. You know, like that's hard to get motivated to not make it great.
Have you ever had like a negotiated contract with like quality levels? So you'd pay this for premium quality, this for medium quality, this for base. I hate that because it's like, so what? You're going to pay me a little bit less and I'm going to like leave a few typos? Like, how do I do that?
Yeah. I think the reality is nobody does this. Nobody gets up in the morning to do a mediocre job.
Right.
Like who is wired that way? No one is wired that way. Everyone gets up in the morning
Especially
and wants
not
to do their
linguists.
best work.
Linguists are passionate about their work.
Yeah.
Right.
So this is where I do believe so much of what has shifted in the industry over the last several years is we still expect linguists to do all that awesome, great work. But what we've done is intercepted it with a process that kind of dictates what's possible from a quality output side. And how much review do you do? Is it full translation? Is it MT plus post edit as a means of determining where the effort should go? Because if we leave it to the linguists, everything is going to be at the highest level effort. So it has to be a managed process at some level. The and decisions do need to be made about like what is very visible. What would embarrass us if it's wrong?
Right.
What does a salesperson have to stand in front of? Or what does a trainer have to stand in front of with customers in the room? Like those are a different level of quality expectation than perhaps a guide I'm reading on my own that I don't even, that I'm
some
referring to as a reference
knowledge
deliverable,
based article that gets
or a
13
blog
clicks a year.
that lasts 10 seconds on the web,
Yeah, exactly.
or a translated document that they already read the English one because it was more time sensitive. And so this is just a nice to have now that's a little bit later in the process. So that's hard. I
Yep.
actually think the hardest part about it is really within our own world, managing the quality expectations, because our customers are usually way more comfortable with a nuanced approach, and they have a good sense of like, this is visible, this isn't.
So
This is
you do have that. 'Cause my next question was going to be, so how do you have those conversations with your stakeholders? Like if you're on the client side and you go to them, because if I don't know anything about localization and you come to me and basically ask me, hey, I'm going to manage your translation, but I have a question for you. Does it need to be good? Like, I'm going to look at you like you grew a second head, right? Like, well,
yeah.
yeah, of course I want it good. So how do you even start those
I think
conversations?
I do think that this is where also engagement matters at all parts of the organization.
Okay.
So having folks in the market that are talking to the local stakeholders makes a difference.
Okay.
Having folks talking to the central teams makes a difference. And there's often a very different picture. On the central teams is like, this is what I can afford to spend, and I want to get this much done. So if this is what you need to do to get this much done, I'm good with it. And in the market, they'll be like, yeah, but in Japan, it really needs to be so much better than this. And
Yeah.
so there's sometimes this kind of a nuance on how you might manage in a region, or the awareness of the visibility that you might have on the ground that you might not have centrally. So it's a balance. This is not science. There's a bit of art in all of this. And I think as well, it helps when there is data, like when you actually can say, this is how many eyes are on this deliverable,
Yeah.
or this is the role of the eyes on this deliverable.
Yeah.
That can make a big difference in the conversation, because like
Data is a love language.
data
It's
helps
the
with
sixth love
yeah.
language.
Yeah, it is. Well, it just like it helps our teams when have a hard conversation around quality. It
Yeah.
helps us as leaders sometimes have a hard conversation around, this is what we're going to do for this deliverable, and this is why.
Yeah. And, no more, never so true as when you're talking to the people holding the purse strings, procurement and finance. And you talked a little bit about that in your multilingual article. You said the biggest challenge is always funding, even under the best of circumstances. Having country revenue targets to balance against the cost is essential. When cost is factored against revenue, it's often a no-brainer. To do this, build a partnership with the selling side of the business so that a viable business case can be created and is mutually supported. Fundamentally, sales and executive leadership need to agree market expansion is needed. Once global companies become mature, adding languages is usually a combination of business drivers and customer need measured against cost. So you're talking about building a business case for localization. You're talking about this topic that will never die and should never die, which is the ROI of localization, right? So
Yep.
I'll just ask you, how do you measure the ROI of localization?
So the most basic way to measure it is if you're not transiting for a market. So say you've done no translations for a market that the company cares about, and they're selling right here. And you translate for the market, and you finally give them the stuff they need in order to have something to sell. You should see their revenue
Yeah.
go up.
So
The most
A/B testing
fundamental
is what you're
measure
talking
is
about.
revenue.
A/B
Yeah.
testing, fancy A/B testing, essentially.
Yeah, and or you prove it in one market, and then you follow with more, and you continue to prove it.
Yeah.
If you get a business case approved, but there's no follow-up on whether any revenue came from it, it can be trickier to get your next business case approved.
Fair.
Right.
Makes sense.
And I do think that there is and this is where it matters, like, what are you spending your money on? Are you spending your money to perfect one small thing that's not helping your company sell and helping your company grow? You're better off doing more things, sacrificing a little quality for the short term to actually give them something to sell, because by the time that sales cycle kicks in, you have time to start working through and improving the quality as you go.
Yep.
And so that does kind of depend upon your deliverable and the nature of your work. I mean, it's not aerospace and it's not medical that I'm chiefly ever involved in. So nobody's going to die if that translation is wrong for a month and then we fix it. Then I do think that's hard, but sometimes that's very much the trade-off to make, is to help the company get to the possibility of generating revenue in markets. And the very first thing is language. Like, that's first. The second thing is, does it work in this country? Is it right? Is it appropriate product feature? And then you get into support and can you all those other things. But the first thing is language, because if it's not in their language, they are not going to buy it.
Well, it should be. The first thing should be languages. I don't know if you've had this, but I've seen this a lot of times, is where a client working on the vendor side, a client will come to us and say, we need all of this stuff, this entire product, all of the help documentation, everything localized into Portuguese for Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, it needs to be done in 3 weeks. And it's like, okay, why? It's like, oh, because we sold a big deal in Brazil, and part of the contract is we need to deliver a localized product, right? So it should, but sometimes the tail's chasing the dog.
That can happen. It so can happen. And
which is fine. As the point that you made earlier is, I don't care if you're vendor side or client side, we are service providers. And we, you can sit here and complain about, oh, we didn't get forecasting. Oh, we don't have this. Work still needs to get done.
Yeah.
It's some
and
heroics, to use your word.
Yeah, it is where the heroics happen.
Yep.
It's so much harder actually it's funny because we spend all of our time trying to get funding for what we do. But one of the hardest things is doing when you get the funding.
Yeah.
That's incredible pressure when you get the funds.
That's when the dog catches the tail.
You have to, okay, we got funded for that, which means great, we can do this, but it means, oh no, we have to do that.
You better have good partnership in your supply chain, is all I'm saying, because otherwise you're in it alone. Hey, we have a question from chat. Daniel asks, can you please explain how software internationalization impacts localization quality?
Oh, I love
a good
this
one.
question. Yeah. Well, so this is how I view internationalization. If you don't have a good practice for internationalization, you've not built that in and partnered with your engineering teams and set standards and implemented tools that help check those things and arm wrestled them to some level of compliance and participation in bug fixing, everything that you don't check for from an internationalization standpoint, you will absolutely be blamed for linguistically from a quality standpoint. Because your customers don't know it's an internationalization bug. They don't care that it's developers' problem. They just think it looks really stupid that this string's in English, or that the date format's wrong, or that this same label is used in 27 places, but it only makes sense in one. Or that you've cobbled together a sentence and it includes 3 different moving parts, and there's no way to make a sentence out of that.
They don't want to hear it.
It's
not their problem.
String.
Yeah. All they care about is they have an angry customer on the phone.
Yeah, and it will come to your team to research first.
Yeah.
So all international issues may start with engineering, but they land on our doorstep.
That's my next question, is whose responsibility?
Upstream.
Yeah, whose responsibility is internationalization?
Yeah.
Is it?
It's in almost every company, it is the engineering team's responsibility.
Yeah. It's kind of a silly question, though, because the better question would be, as you, who cares? Like, who gets blamed if it goes wrong?
We care and we get blamed.
It doesn't matter whose responsibility it is. Who's going to be fired if it's
the
wrong,
bug lands first in our plate, and then we pass it along.
Yeah.
But the other thing about internationalization, I think this is the hardest thing about it, is it's like a lot of little stuff.
Yep.
And because it's a lot of little stuff, not a single one of those bugs is ever going to be, rarely going to be a P1 or even a P2.
Yeah.
So they're very, very low level bugs. So good luck getting all your engineering team to fix all those low level bugs.
Yeah.
It actually takes a commitment and a caring and a mutual relationship and It's really important when you get a new product to get that engagement early with them, because they will never be as committed later. So if you can get a lot of it sorted early on, it helps a lot. So then you've got good hygiene. Then they're brushing their teeth every
like that.
Day,
Building healthy
and not
habits.
going to the dentist for the knock me out and clean me to the bone exercise.
More flossing, fewer root canals is the philosophy.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I'm watching the clock here, Loy, and we're out of time. I think a good place to end this conversation, a lot of what we've talked about is stakeholder engagement and the importance of that. And just a very practical question. Let's say I get hired tomorrow as localization director, new company. Who are the 3 people that I need to reach out to first within that organization?
Okay. You definitely need to have a finance partner, because if you're brand new, you probably don't have any money.
Mm-hmm.
You probably will need a procurement partner pretty fast, because you may or may not have a vendor strategy in place.
Okay.
And you need to identify, I would say it's hard to find 3, but I would say go find your most unhappy stakeholder.
I like that. Do the hard part
Start
first, because they're going to have the best information.
Yeah.
You can't. It's hard to learn from a happy stakeholder, because they're not going to be telling you things that are going wrong. But very good. All right. Well, any other closing thoughts before I start wrapping us up here today, Loy?
No, it's a pleasure. I think this is a fun industry, and I think while the problems are all very much the same for all of us, the nuances and what crops up at different points in time can vary quite a lot. So there's a lot to always be learning, which is fun.
There is always something new. It's good news and bad news, folks. There's always something new, always a new problem to solve. So I will start taking us out. Thank you so much for joining us today, Loy.
Thank you, Trevor. It was a pleasure.
Yes, ma'am. Ladies, gentlemen, chat, we are out of time for today. If you enjoyed this Nifty Live experience, then join us next time, which will be in September, because I'm going on vacation next week. So I ain't going to be here. I appreciate our guest today, Loy Searle. I appreciate my colleagues here at NIMSY Insights doing all the hard work, and I appreciate everyone in the industry who's filling out our surveys and contributing to industry research. And finally, I appreciate you, the audience, for all of the questions and comments in chat, and everybody who is contributing to the conversation that we can all learn from. And with that, I look forward to next time. Cheers.